Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shubrata Mitra. I'm the director of ISIS. On behalf of my colleagues, I'm very, very happy to welcome you all. And since this is the first seminar of the year, I'll take the opportunity to wish you all a very happy new year of joy, peace between India and Pakistan, and most of all, a sense of peace yourselves. I would be saying a few words to welcome you all to the Institute, and Dr. Palit will then take over. He will chair the session, introduce our speaker, and introduce the theme. One of the things that I would like all of us to remember is why we are here in the first place. ISIS does a double act. ISIS is a research institute, but ISIS is also a policy institute. ISIS works for two ministries of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Industry, and the main leitmotif in that avatar, whenever we do anything, we ask ourselves, what is in it for Singapore? That's what policy analysis is about. At the same time, we are also part of NUS, a highly ranked global university of research, and the question then we ask is, what is in it for South Asian studies, or what is in it for political science? Because we have got many disciplines present here, or what is in it for sociology, what is in it for economics. The challenge for us is to see if policy can be made interesting for comparative theory, and if comparative theory can be made to account for itself in terms of the world out there, in terms of policy. Can the two converge? This is the challenge that we face, and that, I think, is the right kind of challenge for all policy institutes to face. Sometimes I get the feeling we are back in the days of Thomas Alva Edison, and the story is his lab was always engaged in inventing useful things, and journalists would be thronging about asking, Mr. Edison, what have you invented today, or what have you invented lately? And I expect people to ask us, what have you invented lately about the issues out there? Will there be peace between India and Pakistan, or will it be business and shooting as usual? That is our equivalent of the challenge of Edison. Edison's challenge was, can you have a light bulb? They already knew that if you hit a metal to very high degrees, superheat, it would produce light. But can it produce light before melting? What kind of alloy will take the heat and produce the light? Now we have to ask ourselves, what kind of combination of force and persuasion will produce peace in between India and Pakistan? Now, I'm not talking as if we are engaged in a scientific analysis, but we are. The world acts according to certain laws, and those laws are the basis of all science. And one of the laws that I have been trained in is the theory of games, that people would always follow their self-interest. And if they follow only their self-interest, they would be like on a highway without any rules, a traffic jam, or there will be anarchy. So what kind of rules, what kind of institutes, what kind of institutions will guide self-interested human beings to becoming good citizens, orderly citizens? That's the kind of research, I think, which will get respect, the way rocket science gets respect from ordinary laymen. The reason I'm going on about this is because this is the first seminar of the year, and this is the first seminar for me of my first calendar year at this institute, and I want to hold on to it. And I want us to remember the challenge that we have to face in order to be taken as responsible, respectable citizens of the NUS. With those words, let me then turn to the topic today, emergence. This is something I would remember as I listened to Professor Jain. The story in emergence research actually comes from Stephen Cohen, one of the most respected names in security analysis. He says, oh, India is one of those countries which is constantly emerging but never quite arriving. Now that's a joke. Why is it that UFA follows a Christmas surprise which follows Pathankot? So what makes emergence possible? If you ask yourself this question, you realize that the first thing all living things have to do is to stay alive, which is to keep the status quo. But if you keep only the status quo, you will not have the energy to emerge from beyond the status quo. So status quo is a bit like a pendulum which swings to a fixed axis, whereas emergence is like a billiard table which you disturb and it comes to a new equilibrium but at a different level. So what takes you away from a static equilibrium to a dynamic equilibrium? That's what emergence is about, and that's the kind of research that we are engaged in today, and I'll be listening with great interest to see what is the science and policy of emergence. And emergence here is not just of the central state of India, but individual units. And this institute takes those component units of India very, very seriously. We have actually a whole program of Chief Minister's research. We are closely connected to Andhra Pradesh, and it's not the only one. Believe it or not, the little tiny Lilliputian Seven Sisters of the Northeast are also often our guests and work directly with us. Then there is the forthcoming visit of the Madhya Pradesh Chief Minister. That will be a public event. So please remember that the topic today is germane to our ongoing program, and Adelaide is a partner university, and Dr. Palit will formally take over, formally welcome our honored guest, and lead us on. I look forward to a very nice conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitra, and I join Professor Mitra in wishing all of you a very happy new year. And also Professor Jain, he apart from a variety of other attributes that he has, he is by profession a professor at the Department of Asian Studies in the University of Adelaide. He teaches in the Department of Asian Studies as well as in the Politics and International Relations Department. He has a number of books to his credit, and his main area of focus, though it is Japan and Japan's foreign policy. He has worked extensively on Indian foreign policy as well, and particularly India-Japan relations. And I think I must mention what in research we call stylized facts. Among all of us, Professor Jain was the first to write for ISAS. His paper on India-Japan relations was published by ISAS in 2008. I think none of us had written for ISAS at that point in time. And that, in fact, historically and empirically, remains the only paper on India-Japan relations which ISAS has published in now. So I think his association with ISAS is the oldest among all of us over here. He has been a visiting fellow at the East Asian Institute in the NUS, and he is, as much as some of us are, he is equally familiar with the old ISAS office in the Bukit Timah campus, which many of us still fondly remember. He has been working on a variety of issues at this point in time, including this particular subject, which is the Indian state's emergence in the international arena. And this, as some of us would know, and including some among you, is increasingly becoming a major aspect of observation when it comes to India's external interface. And this is over the last 1.5 to 2 years that Indian states and their political leaderships are becoming more visible in international forums and in foreign countries, and they are directly connecting to leaderships in foreign countries for expressing the virtues of their states. Most of it is primarily from an economic and investment-seeking perspective, But I think scholars of international relations and political economy would also try to look at it from a larger strategic perspective. This, as we know, has been a practice with the Chinese provinces. Many of them connect to counterpart provinces and countries directly, but this was a much less noticed phenomenon in India. And whether this has anything to do with the principle of competitive federalism that Mr. Modi has been talking about or not is something that we might want to discuss after hearing Professor Jain. But I think that this is going to remain a very relevant subject and a relevant theme for us to keep looking at. And what we are hoping is, in fact, Professor Jain told me that it's already in form of a paper that's gone for a journal, Purnendra, right?
Under review.
Yeah, under review in journal. So it's entered the process of generating pain for the author. And there's obviously no gain without pain, but we are hoping that this would mature into an extremely rich output. And I mentioned about Professor Jain's association with ISAS as an author, but even otherwise, he has been a very old friend of ISAS. In fact, in his capacity as the president of the Asian Studies Association of Australia, he has taken the initiative in getting ISAS to play a fairly prominent role in academic forums and occasions in Australia. He has been one of our oldest friends in that regard, and I, on behalf of ISAS, I acknowledge his efforts in these collaborative pursuits. So, Purnendra, the floor is yours, and you have time till 4, even beyond. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Mitra, for welcoming me here. And I'm very delighted to be here. And this is my first time at ISAS on this campus. As Dr. Palit mentioned, I have been to ISAS on several occasions. And it happened that when I was at East Asian Institute in 2007, I happened to meet the newly appointed then director, Professor Mohan Rao. And we had a conversation in the shuttle bus from our apartment to Bikotima campus. And in that conversation, he became very interested in Japan, and we had a long discussion. He said, why don't you write a working paper? And that's how that developed, and I took 6 months to research and did that paper. And I'm very happy because that paper has been very well cited. And I keep watching citations. We have to do these things these days. So I'm very happy that I wrote that paper. And since then also, as Dr. Palit mentioned, I have had very close interaction with ISAS. So I'm very happy to be back here. And the topic for today's talk, I don't specialize, I should say, in Indian politics, but that has been my passion, because when I started my first job in Delhi University as lecturer in political science, I used to teach Indian politics. This is what I was given, and I taught that for 6 years before I moved to Japanese politics and foreign policy and so on and so forth. So my interest in Indian politics goes back, and I'm retracing my roots, so to say. And this came as a result of my research on Japan, because I did a book on looking at Japan's subnational governments and their role in international affairs. That book came out in 2005, 2006, and that was translated in Japanese in 2008. But since then, I also tried to take that conceptual model and try to apply that to a particular state in Australia, South Australia. And I came up as an edited book called The Engaging State, talking about South Australia's relations with a number of Asia-Pacific nations. Now, in the last 2 years, I started thinking, why can't I do similar thing about Indian states? So I went through the literature. I didn't find much. There were a few articles here and there on this issue. So I thought, well, that will be an interesting aspect of my research. A bit of change from Japan, diversion from Japan. So in 2014, when I was on sabbatical, I was in India for 3 months working on this particular theme and paper. And I developed this paper in association with a young researcher in India, Dr. Mani, and I say here that this talk is based on research which I did with him.
He's also from ISIS.
Oh, right, okay. So he's also from ISIS. Okay, that's great. So now, let me take you to, so last year, 2015, these are just some sample headlines from the Indian Express, from the Times of India, from the Hindu, and NDTV. You will see how Indian chief ministers are traveling overseas, and they are seen as important actors by the current Prime Minister in particular, and Narendra Modi. For example, you see Fadnavis remains Modi's choice for bilateral tours. So he took Fadnavis with him to China and to other countries. Of course, Mamata Banerjee was part of Narendra Modi's trip to Bangladesh. And Chandrababu Naidu, the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, was actually quite remarkably, he was asked by the Ministry of External Affairs to go to China before Prime Minister Modi visit, as if to prepare the ground, which is kind of unthinkable in Indian politics, especially state level politics, that the Ministry of External Affairs will extend that kind of invitation to a chief minister. So this is just kind of preface to give you some idea as to how chief ministers are becoming kind of key actors in India's foreign affairs. Now, what I want to argue actually today, briefly, I have got about 15 slides, so I will talk 3-4 minutes each slide. That will give me 40 minutes, 45 minutes quickly. 4 or 5 slides are kind of tables, so I can go through them very quickly. So I want to say that, yes, Indian states are becoming emerging actors in foreign affairs. And I like this idea of emerging, as the director mentioned, Professor Mitra mentioned. I never quite thought about, what does this emergence mean? But now I will keep that in mind a little bit more carefully. And I argue that these state governments have got their own local interests. And they're trying to promote their local interests. Sometimes these local interests can complement national interests. Sometimes they might work in opposition to the national interests. And these national interests could be both economic and political and a variety of other things. But also, I want to say that when I say emergence of these states in foreign affairs, their actions are still very limited. They have got very limited resources, financial, human resources, all kinds of resources are extremely limited, and there are constraints in a number of ways. And when I talk about states, I'm not talking about all states in India, because you see there's a whole lot of variation in the states. Some are very big, some are relatively small, their financial capacity, their leadership capacity, all these things vary quite significantly. And these state governments or state governments in India are really late bloomers or late comers in terms of their interaction with the global community. If we compare from other provincial leaders around the world, including, you mentioned about China, and I include Japan in that as well. So Indian subnational actors are extremely latecomers on the global scene, but nevertheless, as I say, they are emerging. And the good point or the positive point is that there is a degree of recognition at the national level of these subnational actors being or starting to play some role globally, both in diplomatic circles as well as in political circles. Recently, I interviewed some of the Ministry of External Affairs officials. Actually, I also interviewed Jaishankar, our Foreign Secretary, and I talked about these issues, and certainly the conclusion which I drew, they are very much now receptive for these state governments to go out and be there and play roles on behalf of the national government, as well as something which suits their local interests. So this this emergence of state actors in foreign affairs has got implications, not just for foreign affairs, but also the relationship between the national government and the state government, right? So how do I structure this talk? I say what and why. What do they influence? They influence India's foreign policy, especially in India's border states, right? So I will talk about some of the border states. In particular, I will talk about West Bengal and Tamil Nadu. The other thing they do is they seek economic opportunities to enhance their economic and commercial activities through global linkages. And that is kind of very intuitive because most subnational actors, they do these kinds of things. And I just said Indian state governments are latecomers and they're doing this. And this has happened, one, because of advent of coalition governments in India. Like state governments having any kind of influence on national government policy was completely unthinkable. But this happened because of the advent of coalition governments in the 1980s, 1990s, or since the 1980s. And of course, globalization is another important factor because some state governments are trying to globalize, think they're beyond their state or national border as to what they can take advantage of globalization. And I'm looking at three types of states actually in this talk. States that have borders with India's neighboring states to assess influence on India's foreign relations. Two, those with lead roles in promoting trade and attracting investment, and those that in more recent years are becoming internationally active, what I call them Me Tooism states. That because others are doing, let me try, right? So Me Tooism states, these types of states are becoming kind of quite prominent. Now, subnational governments in India, I am talking about essentially state governments. There are 29 of them, right? Plus 7 union territories, plus hundreds and thousands of lower levels of entities. I'm not talking about them so much here beyond the scope of this discussion. So states, as we all know, they are constitutional entities in the Indian Constitution, right? But they have been highly dependent on this national government. The system in India, although federal, has been quite centralized. And if you look at the studies which have been done on Indian states, they essentially relate to politics, elections, little about states as economic units. We hear some, but we did not hear much about states being some kind of international actors. So I think to look at subnational governments in India as international actors is something, in my view, is quite interesting. Okay, I said Indian states or the system in India, what I call a centralized federal system. It is a federal system, but it is highly centralized. And highly centralized is a because of the Congress, what Rajni Kothari famously talked about, the Congress system, right? In the 1950s, 1960s, he was talking about one-party dominant system, and the center, as well as most states, were ruled by the same political party. And if not, then came a new culture in India of presidential rule, right? If states don't comply politically with the central government, then the chances would be there will be some kind of presidential rule. And I don't need to go into details of these things because we have got an audience here who is much more educated and learned about Indian politics than I am. Then how states were or have been controlled or centralized entities. If you look at the Planning Commission, for example, if you look at the entire administrative structure, completely dominated by the civil service which is appointed and responsible to the central government. So in all high-level administrative positions, you have got these IAS officers, you have got civil service officers, you have got central service officers, you have got Indian police service officers. So the entire top administrative machinery in a state governments is run by administrators whose allegiance is to the national government. So they certainly work in the interest, more in the interest of the national government than they would work in the interest of the state government. And this centralization in the foreign arena, of course, has been more pronounced. If even within domestic, economic, and policy matters, if there has been so much centralization, it will be unthinkable that states would be some kind of an international actor. But good thing is we are seeing some researchers who are looking at states as important actors. One book which I came across last year is by William Menthalis, who has compared India and China. And he has looked at local politics in India and China and how these localities or subnational governments have gone global, which is quite an interesting study, I would think. The other thing, perhaps you would know, late last year, Mint Asia and the Institute of Competitiveness, they published a new report called the State Competitiveness Report, which is very interesting. It cost $1,000 US. I can't afford to buy this particular report, but I saw some of the summaries here and there, which look to me very interesting because they have gone beyond the country level analysis, and they have analyzed each state and what their economic, and they are using Michael Porter's model to look at these state level economies, and they have produced this report, which I would love to read in its entirety, but I don't think I have to wait until it comes in my library or somewhere else because I don't want to spend $1,000 US. Given the Australian dollar slide downwards in a big way, that will mean 1,500 Aussie dollars. No. But anyway, this is quite an interesting study. So what I'm trying to say here is that now researchers are focusing on states as units of action, activity in their own right, and not just looking from top down, but it is kind of bottom up perspective, which is being looked at from different perspectives by different researchers. Now, in comparative terms, subnational governments in international affairs, as I said, is not something new. It is there. And researchers have used different kinds of terms to talk about these subnational level activities globally and internationally. They call it sub-state diplomacy, para-diplomacy, proto-diplomacy, all those kinds of things. But interestingly, if you look at comparative literature on this issue, it's very interesting. If you look at, for example, Belgium, a very small state in many ways, they call it federated state diplomacy. In other words, some of the units within Belgium, they almost carry out independently their foreign affairs and foreign policy independently of the federal government. In the case of Canada, for example, if you look at the literature, that is more remarkable in some sense. As I have put on my slide here, for example, Quebec, they have got general delegations, what they call general delegations. I mean, the state, the province is represented internationally in many countries, and they have got their own offices, kind of, you can call them embassies of Quebec in many countries. So they operate as if that's an independent state within Canada. Of course, such kinds of activities you don't see in many other countries, but there are some extreme examples. But when it comes to India, as I will explain, Indian states have been kind of pretty late in this kind of thinking and coming to these kinds of actions. So the message which we get from the comparative literature is that nation-state sovereignty has become perforated. What they call perforated, it's not like one line, but it's the perforated sovereignty. And the nation-state is not the sole actor in international affairs. There are a whole range of other actors, but here we are talking about subnational governments. Still governments, but subnational. I'm not talking about NGOs or business and corporations here. Essentially, I'm talking about governments, but they are not national. We can call them non-central government or non-federal government. So in all these countries in North America and Europe in particular, as I said, the example of Belgium, but there are many others, Australia, even countries like Brazil, their provinces are becoming very active in promoting themselves internationally in terms of linking themselves for trade and investment purposes. In Asia, Japan, China, so both federal and unitary types of states, subnational governments have been actively seeking international engagement at different levels. So what we are talking here about India is not something entirely new. What we are saying that Indian states have come to realize that they need to connect themselves internationally in this globalized world. Now, Indian states influencing foreign policy, and I said I will talk about the role of border states, and there are two examples which I have examined. One is West Bengal, and the other is Tamil Nadu. Now, you know the Teesta Water River Agreement with Bangladesh is still under negotiation. It hasn't gone through. But the interesting thing is in 2011, when the Congress party was in power, Manmohan Singh, almost it looked like that the agreement was going to be signed. But at the last minute, the chief minister of West Bengal, no, not chief minister, she was part of the coalition government at the center, Mamata Banerjee's, right? TNC, Trinamool National Congress. So the West Bengal government and the TNC, they backed out, and they said that they will not, they are not in favor of this agreement. And we know that international agreement is an area where the national government has got the power to sign an international agreement. But in this particular case, the West Bengal government, the TNC, and Mamata Banerjee, they kind of acted as a veto to stop this water river agreement to go ahead, because their argument was that the agreement which was going to be signed will be disadvantageous to West Bengal. this is something very interesting in my view, that a state government can act as a kind of real veto, and the central government drops that agreement at the last minute. And this agreement has not been signed to date, right? Although lots of negotiations are still going on. The other example which comes to my mind is Sri Lanka, or India's relations with Sri Lanka, and the role of Tamil Nadu government, both DMK and AIA-DMK, right? So if you look at the Tamil Nadu government has been very critical of human rights conditions in Sri Lanka, especially in relation to the Tamil population there. And apart from being very critical, they almost forced the Indian government to vote against Sri Lanka in the United Nations twice, right? So, and again, because of this regional political party being in alliance with the Congress, they had that political influence and political power to force the central government to do what the Tamil Nadu government wanted them to do. So also, the Tamil Nadu government almost forced Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to not to go to the CHOGM meeting in Colombo in 2013. And many analysts have argued that India-Sri Lanka relations really deteriorated as a result of Tamil Nadu's political influence on the national government, and the Rajapaksa government then became closer to China, partly because India was not doing any friendly act to Sri Lanka. But that's a separate story and separate analysis, but those kinds of analysis have been presented. So it's not just these are some of the negative examples, one could say, that how state governments have influenced India's foreign policy in relation to neighboring states. But there are some positive examples as well. If you look at some of the northeast Indian states, such as Tripura and Meghalaya, they are working in partnership with the Modi government now in terms of the land boundary agreement, for example, is a good example, is a good policy area which one could look at. Because only a few months ago, this boundary agreement was signed between India and Bangladesh after a long period of negotiation, and this was supported by all 5 northeast Indian states, including West Bengal. And Modi had all these chief ministers with him when he went to sign this particular treaty. And that tells us not only the importance of these state governments, but also acknowledgement of the national government and the current leadership, that how state chief ministers are important if the national government has to sign these kinds of agreement with border states. Now, the other side of it is, of course, economic interests overseas. How do they these state governments pursue their economic interests overseas? 2 states in particular, one could point out, who were kind of early leaders, if you like, Gujarat in central India, and Andhra, kind of southern India. There has been lots of stories written about Gujarat and Andhra, but I haven't seen kind of a systematic study of how Andhra or how Gujarat or even Tamil Nadu states they pursued, what kind of strategy did they pursue, what kinds of human resources did they have. No one has done any research in any depth, but we hear lots of stories that yes, Modi as Gujarat chief minister and Chandrababu Naidu previously and now as Andhra chief minister has done a whole lot of stuff to attract investment from a range of countries, but mainly from Japan in Gujarat, or even from the US in Andhra and Tamil Nadu and so on and so forth. So traveling abroad for bilateral economic partnership and attending global forums. These are the two instruments which chief ministers have actually employed. And I have got some actually some of these tables which are rather, sorry, it may not be very clear here, but you can see it started only in the 21st century when you have got world leaders visiting states or cities in India. Every time world leaders would go to New Delhi, right? And that's where their port of call was. But Bill Clinton, in 2000, he went to Andhra Pradesh. And we know this story about Andhra modernizing kind of high-tech things, and the Clinton administration got interested as to what Chandrababu Naidu was doing then. Then, interestingly, the Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihiro Mori, he went to Karnataka, again, because of IT and other stuff, and Japan wanted to engage with India after this 1998 big hiccup between India and Japan. And since then, not many, but you can see in more recent years, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, thank you very much, that's better. All these leaders, they are going to regional centers or state capitals in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, Ahmedabad. So again, the story here is also one could see how some southern states and some central Indian states are more prominent in terms of these foreign leaders going to these cities. Now, Indian chief ministers, the list is not actually complete, but this gives you some sense as to how Indian chief ministers are traveling overseas. You will see Andhra, then you have got Telangana, you have got West Bengal, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Bihar is Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Punjab. So state leaders are now traveling internationally, and these are really a kind of real business trips, because they are meeting business leaders, they are meeting political leaders in order to make them interested as to what they're doing to attract investment and to do trade with these countries. So this is something very, very recent, although, as I said, it started 15 years ago. And some of these state governments are doing what they call investor summits. The main one, of course, Gujarat, which started under Modi in 2002, and they do it almost on a biennial basis. Every 2 years, they have got this Gujarat summit called Vibrant Gujarat, right? But also other states, Karnataka and Maharashtra, even Punjab, now Rajasthan, they all have got some kinds of investor summits happening in their states on an irregular basis, not very regular, but on an irregular basis. Gujarat is the only one which has been doing that on a very, very regular basis every second year. Now you might think, after all, what do all these visits translate into? And it is sometimes very difficult to have a connection, clear connection between these visits to actual investment in those states. And also for me, it has been very difficult to find state level investments coming from which part of the world. It is very difficult. The Department of International, DIPP,
Industrial Promotion and
Policy, they have got a website. You can find some information, but it's not really complete. But if you can help me here with finding some more details on that kind of details, I will be very grateful. But this is what I have found through the DIPP website, that state governments are receiving investment, but from where they are receiving, that information comes in bits and pieces through newspaper reports, but not anything in a detailed way where we can say that these are the main countries where investment is coming from in such and such states. You can get how much money investment has come, but you cannot find which are the investors in those countries, in those states. Now the third type, I said Me Tooism estates, and this is Bihar, MP, Rajasthan, and UP. It's called BIMARU, which is Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and UP, which most of you would know is a homonym for BIMARU means being sick. Yeah, being sick. But this is BIMARU is Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, MA, Rajasthan, RA, and UP is U, right? And this was actually coined by a very famous demographer, Ashish Bose. The late Ashish Bose, I think he passed away last year. And the simple, his explanation was that these 4 states were the real problems for the Indian economy, right? They were not pulling their weight. They were most populous, and the population was growing very, very fast in these countries. So he had written a report for then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to do something about it or to think about. But these so-called BIMARU estates, or 6 states, they have come out of that kind of mental frame, and they are thinking as to what they can do in terms of connecting themselves to the international community, or to the how they can become global. And also, these are landlocked states. That's another thing. They are not coastal states like Gujarat or Tamil Nadu or another, they are not coastal states. They are landlocked states, and it is but they have recently started thinking in terms of connecting themselves, and in what area can they connect. That is something also interesting, because everyone cannot be an IT estate. Every estate cannot be kind of trading estate. So they have to think in terms of agriculture. For example, UP, Akhilesh Yadav is thinking more in terms of how agro-industry, Bihar agro-industry, how those industries could be developed through connection with or to learn something from the international or the world community. So Nitish Kumar visit to China. Actually, interestingly, in my research, it also showed that Lalu Yadav he went to some Southeast Asian countries, to UK, to US in 1995, but I don't know whether he was really seeking investment for Bihar, or kind of promoting himself as a prospective national leader and so on and so forth. But certainly, Rajasthan's Chief Minister, Vasundhara Raje, and we have heard from the director that Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh will be here next week giving a talk. Unfortunately, I won't be here, otherwise I would have asked. It would have been a very good opportunity for me to have interviewed him on this particular issue. But I'm sure he will talk something about his plans and his strategy, why he is trying to engage with the international community. Now, I would also think that states have been thinking about and doing a few things, but they were not really encouraged by the national government in a very positive way. But since the coming of the Modi government, it seems to me, and looking at the evidence, it seems to me that the Modi government is trying to encourage state governments to become active. And if you look at some of his statements, some of his speeches, he talks about state governments being important actors or at least important partners in progress. In his Make in India program, he understands that without states' participation, his idea of Make in India will remain kind of unfulfilled. It will be very difficult for him to drive everything from the national level until and unless the state levels and state chief ministers come on board. It is very difficult for him to achieve that. So in a sense, the national government under the national government under Prime Minister Modi has realized that it is important to acknowledge the role of states, although in a limited way, and a bottom-up approach in foreign affairs to me is emerging, but still kind of if you do in terms of international comparison, of course Indian states remain far away on those indices or index, but still they are coming up in that particular area. Now what this new action or development tells us about the national-subnational relations in India. As I said, the breakdown of the Congress party monopoly on Indian politics has led to this kind of influence of regional political parties and state governments on foreign policy outcomes. I don't know whether there have been some other examples in the past where, for example, Nadu and others might have considered a particular state view on foreign policy, whether something happened in Jammu and Kashmir or Punjab. I haven't gone that deep, but I would be very much interested if you could give me some feedback on those kinds of issues. But in recent years, what I have noted that because of these regional political parties and their critical role in maintaining the coalition governments at the national level has given them that influence and power in foreign affairs, especially as I mentioned about the the water agreement, or the question of human rights, or what Sri Lankan government was doing with the Tamil population there. So these SNG, these SNG leaders, their initiatives have emerged because of their realization that they need to connect themselves if they want to make their states economically prosperous, improve the lifestyle of people. They need to go beyond the Indian border or borders and connect themselves with the international community. And some leaders, as I said, have been pioneers, Gujarat and Andhra. Other Indian state leaders are learning, what I call policy learning. And there is kind of competition which is emerging within states for investment, and they are trying to follow each other and trying to look at each other what others are doing. And national government's recognition, I talked about the Ministry of External Affairs. Amitendu mentioned the other day that MEA has now a new division which is called State Planning Division. The idea is to coordinate state governments and their political leaders when they visit overseas, so that there is some kind of understanding between the national government and the state governments, and the two do not go into different directions, or at least make statements which are not inconsistent with the national government policy. Now, there are certainly lots of challenges in terms of these state governments becoming real and powerful, influential actors on the international scene. One is there is a lack of institutionalization. It's all kind of political leaders, chief ministers, their own views, their own ideas. But I don't see, and I'm not aware of these state governments having some kind of a a small division of international affairs, let alone maintaining an office overseas, even within the Indian embassy premises. So those kinds of things we haven't seen. So there is a strong lack of institutionalization at the state level in terms of their international engagement. So they really need to think about this as a policy issue and need to do something about it if they are seriously, they seriously want to be effective and influential international actors. Lack of policy focus direction is another thing, because as I said, these political leaders have got some ideas, but they don't know how to execute them, implement them, what to do. Sometimes it seems to me that, they go to foreign countries, either to France or the Netherlands or somewhere, but they don't have exactly the right kind of ideas as to what they are looking for. It's a kind of exploration for them. They go on exploring these things without formal agenda at times, it looks to me. And also there is kind of lack of coordination, although I said there now the Ministry of External Affairs has got this state division, but there's still kind of lack of coordination between the state and national and subnational level. And we all know what kinds of legal and regulatory issues complicate this problem. And this report on state competitiveness really brings out lots of legal and regulatory issues at the state level, and the kinds of handicaps which state governments have got. Having said all these things, looking at the empirical details, one can certainly conclude that this is a new beginning in India's state-level leadership and state-level activity, and activity which is not just domestic, it is becoming international. And this recognition that they have to do something internationally is becoming a stronger. I just said that this is kind of Me Tooism. But if you look at the details, as I had shown on some of these tables, it's very clear that there are only a handful of states which have become active, maybe maximum 5 to 8. That's it, out of 29. So the other 21 are not really anywhere near even becoming to the extent what the UP government or the Bihar government is doing. So they haven't done anything with regard to this particular issue. So it's still kind of in a very, very nascent role of these state governments in international affairs. I think I have gone over time. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
Thank you, Purnendra. And